The courtroom was packed, the tension in the air almost palpable. News of Clint Eastwood stepping into a real legal battle had made headlines, and today, the buzz was louder than ever. Cameras flashed as Clint, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted his usually rugged appearance, entered the room. Every head in the room turned to him, his legendary persona almost filling the entire space. Clint Eastwood was here, but not as an actor or director, he was here as a man fighting for his rights, a man trying to win in a world where he was used to making things happen on screen, not in reality. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was a courtroom. And in this particular courtroom, the man who ruled over it was none other than Judge Robert McAllister. McAllister had a reputation, one that people often whispered about in hushed tones. He was known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, his sharp mind, and his apparent disdain for anyone who tried to play the system. He didn't care who you were or how famous you were. In his court, everyone was equal, and that was exactly how he liked it. As Clint walked toward his seat, the murmurs grew louder. The whispers were filled with disbelief. Clint Eastwood, the icon, the tough guy who'd never backed down in his films, now sitting in the defendant's chair. But it wasn't just his presence that was causing the stir. It was the judge's voice that cut through the murmurs. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge McAllister said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he glanced up from his papers. "I trust this isn't one of your movie scripts. Because in my courtroom, there's no room for rehearsed performances. Let's see how well you do without the help of a script and a director." The room fell silent. It was an unexpected jab, one that seemed almost cruel coming from a man who had made a name for himself on the bench by being cold, calculating, and fair. But McAllister, like many in the courtroom, was not impressed by the man sitting before him. He didn't care about Clint Eastwood's fame, his accolades, or the countless awards he had won. To him, Clint was just another defendant, one who was about to experience the full weight of the law. Clint sat there, his face a mask of calm. His eyes never left the judge, his expression unchanged. In that moment, the legendary actor didn't seem like the Clint Eastwood the world knew from film, he seemed like a man who had learned to control his emotions, to mask any vulnerability with a stone-cold exterior. But underneath that exterior, something was stirring. There was no way Clint would let himself be mocked, not in front of a room full of people, not by a judge who clearly thought of him as little more than an actor who didn't belong in his courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood," McAllister continued, leaning forward with a smug smile. "I suggest you leave the theatrics at the door and focus on the matter at hand. This is serious business, not a stage performance. You may be good at playing the tough guy on screen, but here, you'll find the rules are a bit different." Clint took a deep breath. The mockery wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge. And Clint Eastwood never backed down from a challenge, not in the movies, and certainly not now. This was his fight. And no matter how condescending McAllister was, Clint wasn't about to let him think for 1 second that he was in over his head. "Your Honor," Clint said in a calm, measured voice, his deep baritone echoing through the room. "I've dealt with tough situations before. I'm not here to play any games." A few people in the room exchanged looks, clearly unsure of how to react. Some of them probably expected Clint to take the bait, to rise to the challenge with some witty retort or sarcastic comment. But Clint was more than that. He wasn't going to give McAllister the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. "Good," McAllister replied, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the case files in front of him. "Then let's get started, shall we?" As the proceedings began, Clint kept his cool. The case at hand was complex, nothing like the simple, straightforward plots of the movies he was used to. This wasn't a scene with a clear hero and villain. There were no easy resolutions, no clear path to victory. But Clint was no stranger to adversity, and he wasn't about to back down now. He had a point to prove, not just to McAllister, but to himself. The first few hours were excruciating. McAllister threw question after question at Clint, each one designed to rattle him, to expose any weakness. But Clint answered each one with unwavering confidence. He wasn't going to let the judge get under his skin. He had learned long ago that staying calm and focused was his best weapon in any situation. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. The more McAllister prodded, the more Clint began to feel like this wasn't just about the case anymore. It was personal. McAllister's mockery, his dismissive attitude, it felt like an attack on Clint's character. But that was exactly what Clint needed. He needed the fire. The challenge. And now, more than ever, he could feel the flicker of something deep inside him igniting. This wasn't just a case, this was a chance to show that no one, not even the most intimidating judge, could break him. Not now, not ever. By the time the session broke for the day, Clint had not uttered a single word in his defense. He hadn't needed to. He had let McAllister believe that Clint was just another defendant who would roll over under pressure. But Clint wasn't done. The real game was only just beginning, and Clint Eastwood was ready to play. The question that lingered in the air, however, was this: what happens when you push someone like Clint Eastwood too far? What happens when you mock a man who's been through more than most could ever imagine? Clint knew the answer. It was a question that would soon be answered in the most unexpected way possible. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? And as Clint left the courtroom that day, his mind already working on the next step, one thing was for certain: Judge McAllister had no idea what he had just unleashed. Clint Eastwood sat in the quiet of his office, the faint hum of the city outside seeping through the windows. He had faced adversity before, many times, in fact. His life, both on and off the screen, had been filled with its fair share of highs and lows, but today felt different. Today, the weight of the mockery from Judge McAllister still lingered. It wasn't the case at hand that worried him, it was the personal jab, the unnecessary undermining of who he was as a man, as a person. That wasn't something Clint took lightly. But Clint had learned long ago that life didn't care about your feelings. You had to push through, no matter the obstacles. His career had always been about overcoming those hurdles, whether it was on the screen as a cowboy, a tough cop, or an aging hero, or off-screen in his personal life. He was a man who had carved out a reputation in Hollywood and beyond. His name was a symbol of strength, grit, and determination. But the man behind the legend was someone much more complicated than the roles he played. Born in San Francisco, Clint had always known struggle. His parents had separated when he was young, and he had lived a life full of uncertainty. He didn't come from wealth or privilege, but he learned early on that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. Football, boxing, and later acting, each challenge seemed to shape him, molding him into the kind of man who could hold his own in any room. But none of that had prepared him for what life was about to throw his way when he was thrust into the public eye. Acting had never been Clint's first choice, but his natural charisma and tough demeanor had caught the attention of Hollywood agents early on. He had struggled in his early years, auditions, bit parts, and low-paying roles in TV shows, before his breakthrough role in Rawhide. But it wasn't until his role in A Fistful of Dollars that Clint truly became a household name. The iconic image of him in a poncho, his steely gaze, and the way he carried himself on screen left audiences in awe. But Clint Eastwood, the actor, was more than just that lone cowboy. Behind the tough guy persona, there was a man who wrestled with his own demons, his own fears, and, perhaps most powerfully, his own desire to be respected. Yet, for all the fame and fortune, Clint's personal life was often a mess. He had been married twice and had a string of relationships, some public, some private, each of which left scars. Fatherhood had been a complicated journey for him. He had 8 children from various relationships, some of whom he wasn't always close to, and others who had challenged him in ways he had never expected. These challenges had humbled him, but they also gave him a depth that no one saw when they looked at the man in front of the camera. Clint had always kept a tight grip on his personal life, but it wasn't always smooth sailing. And then came politics, his move into the public realm as more than just an actor. The pressure to shift from the tough, gunslinging roles to the serious political statements he started to make was a leap few could understand. But Clint had never been afraid to speak his mind. He became mayor of Carmel, California, a small town he loved dearly. Despite the controversies surrounding some of his stances, he embraced the challenge. Politics suited him in a way that acting never could. There was something about fixing problems in the real world that felt more authentic than playing a character in front of a camera. And yet, here he was, in a courtroom, as a defendant, with his entire legacy on the line. It wasn't the Hollywood spotlight or the accolades he had spent a lifetime earning that had brought him here, it was a legal battle that, at first glance, seemed like a simple dispute. But Clint knew better. The more he sat with it, the more he realized this was more than just another case. This was his fight. His chance to prove that, despite all the challenges life had thrown at him, he was more than capable of facing the ultimate test. Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the table thoughtfully. The mockery from Judge McAllister had been a spark, one that set off a chain of thoughts in Clint's mind. He had been through the worst Hollywood had to offer, the harshest critics, the public scrutiny, and the scandalous headlines. None of that ever fazed him. But this was different. McAllister's words had triggered something deep inside him, a feeling that this courtroom, this man who dared to mock him, had no idea what kind of storm he was about to awaken. Behind Clint's steely exterior was a man who had weathered countless storms, faced more demons than anyone could imagine, and come out stronger on the other side. And now, it was time to put all those lessons into practice. He wasn't just going to win this case, he was going to make sure Judge McAllister understood exactly who Clint Eastwood was. As he got up to leave, Clint's mind raced with ideas. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore, it was about making sure that Judge McAllister, and everyone in that courtroom, would understand what it meant to face a man like Clint Eastwood. The next day, Clint showed up to court prepared. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood who walked in the day before, this was someone else entirely. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now. His eyes were sharp, his posture even more resolute. Today, Clint wasn't just going to sit there and let McAllister's jabs go unanswered. He was going to fight back, like he had done so many times before. The courtroom buzzed as Clint made his way to his seat, and the judge, McAllister, raised an eyebrow. "Ready for round 2, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint's lips curled into a slight smile. "Let's just say I'm done with the jokes, Your Honor. Let's get to business." The game was on. The courtroom was filled with an undeniable tension, the kind that seemed to thicken the air, as though everyone in the room was waiting for something to snap. Clint Eastwood, now seated across from Judge McAllister, had settled into a calm yet intense demeanor. The events of the previous day hadn't shaken him, in fact, they had only steeled his resolve. The challenge had been set, and Clint had every intention of meeting it head-on. Judge McAllister sat high upon his bench, a sharp, disapproving look never leaving his face as he glanced over at Clint. His expression was one of amusement, but there was a coldness to it, as if he was silently daring Clint to step out of line. This wasn't a man who was going to go easy on anyone, especially not someone like Clint Eastwood, a figure with an ego that had built an empire. McAllister wasn't one to care for reputations, he only cared about justice. Or rather, his own brand of it. Clint, for his part, had come prepared. The man who had walked in the day before with a quiet confidence had now shed any semblance of hesitation. His eyes were sharp, his every movement deliberate. Today was different. He wasn't just here to defend himself, he was here to win, and he would do whatever it took to prove that Judge McAllister was wrong about him. As the trial resumed, Clint listened intently as the prosecution presented its case. It was a clear and simple accusation. Clint had broken an agreement that had cost a business partner significant financial loss. The details were murky, but the public nature of the case had given it an almost celebrity-like feel. Clint was being portrayed as a Hollywood star who had stepped too far outside his realm, too full of himself to follow basic business protocol. But Clint was no stranger to being misunderstood. In fact, he had made a career out of it. What most didn't see, what McAllister and the prosecution didn't understand, was Clint's ability to read people, his uncanny knack for understanding motives and intentions with surgical precision. He had done this in his films, portraying characters who were always one step ahead, always calculating the next move. This was no different, and Clint knew it. McAllister's voice interrupted his thoughts, harsh and commanding. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Clint's eyes met McAllister's, his gaze steady and unwavering. The judge's expression was unreadable, but Clint could see the challenge there, the dare. He wasn't going to let Clint off easy, not by any means. "I do," Clint said simply, his voice calm yet full of authority. "But first, I'd like to know exactly what we're accusing me of. So far, everything I've heard is based on assumptions and conjecture. No one has proven anything." The room grew silent as McAllister's lips tightened. "The evidence is clear, Mr. Eastwood. You failed to uphold your end of a business agreement. The prosecution has made its case." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Let's talk about this evidence, then." He leaned forward slightly, his expression calculating. The tension in the room was rising. McAllister's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for the prosecution to continue, clearly growing more irritated with Clint's interruption. But Clint wasn't finished. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. As the prosecution went on, he let their arguments wash over him, listening, watching, waiting. McAllister, clearly growing impatient, finally slammed his gavel down. "Mr. Eastwood, this is not a negotiation. You are here to defend yourself, not question the entire structure of this court. Do you understand?" Clint's gaze never wavered. He had faced far worse than the sharp tones of an angry judge. "I understand, Your Honor," he replied. "But I also know when I'm being handed a script I didn't write." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. It was as if everyone, even McAllister, was taken aback by Clint's response. The judge's eyes flashed with anger, but Clint didn't flinch. He had just planted a seed of doubt in the judge's mind, and he knew that would be the first step toward turning this trial in his favor. The prosecution continued their case, but Clint had already begun to map out his next move. He wasn't going to let McAllister, or anyone else for that matter, control the narrative. He had the skills to turn the tide, to expose weaknesses in the case and the legal system itself. Hours passed in the courtroom, each side making its arguments, but Clint's mind was already several steps ahead. He had observed enough, learned enough, to know that the key to winning wasn't just proving his innocence. It was about revealing the cracks in the case and, more importantly, in McAllister's approach to justice. As the day came to a close, Clint's mind was already racing. He hadn't spoken much, but that had been intentional. He wasn't here to give speeches or make grand gestures. He was here to win, and to do that, he needed to stay in control. When the session broke, Clint stood up slowly, his eyes briefly meeting the judge's. McAllister, still looking disapproving, made a pointed comment as Clint turned to leave. "You're not here to make a scene, Mr. Eastwood. Keep that in mind as we move forward." Clint gave a slight nod, but the smile that tugged at his lips wasn't one of submission. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Clint Eastwood wasn't here to play by the judge's rules. He was here to rewrite the script. As he walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the situation hung in the air. There was no going back now. The conflict had only just begun, and Clint was ready to turn the tables. But McAllister had no idea just how out of his depth he was. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who could make movies, he was a man who could manipulate the game, and McAllister had just walked into a fight he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, Clint Eastwood woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. He didn't need much sleep, the mind of a strategist never rested. He had always been an early riser, even during the years when he was filming back-to-back projects in distant locations. There was something about the quiet of the morning that suited him, no distractions, just his thoughts and the world still in a peaceful slumber. As he sat at his desk, sipping his coffee, Clint reflected on the previous day's events. Judge McAllister had tried to throw him off, and the prosecutor had played their part in pushing an argument that was far from solid. But Clint knew something others didn't. This case wasn't just about winning, it was about setting the stage for a much larger game. Every word, every gesture, every move had to be calculated. His life in Hollywood, and his political ventures, had taught him one thing: appearances were everything, but results were all that mattered. Clint pulled out his legal notes from the previous day. He'd made mental notes during the trial, and now it was time to put them into action. His lawyer, a seasoned professional named Rachel Collins, had done the heavy lifting when it came to the legal minutiae. But Clint wasn't just going to sit on the sidelines. He was going to get in the game himself. He knew McAllister's type, he'd encountered men like him before, people who were too proud of their power to see when they were making a mistake. McAllister wasn't going to see what Clint had planned, not until it was too late. Rachel had been the one to pick up on McAllister's pattern of behavior. He liked to think of himself as the hero, the one who stood above it all, handing out justice as if it were candy. But Clint could see the cracks. The man was too focused on his own authority, and he didn't take kindly to being challenged. That was Clint's opening. Clint had worked with some of the smartest people in Hollywood, producers, directors, and writers who could craft a narrative with the best of them. And now, he was going to use those same storytelling skills to craft a narrative of his own. One that would make McAllister question his own assumptions and, ultimately, his own position. But he had to be careful. Too much too soon, and McAllister would shut him down before Clint had a chance to play his hand. No, Clint was a master of pacing. He would reveal his cards slowly, one at a time, until McAllister had no choice but to fold. As he made his way to the courthouse, Clint could already feel the weight of the day ahead. It wasn't just the legal proceedings that worried him, it was the growing sense that this trial was becoming more than just a case. The courtroom was starting to feel like a stage, with Clint as both the actor and the director, carefully controlling the narrative that was unfolding. The first sign that things were different today came when Clint entered the courtroom. McAllister was already there, as expected, but his usual air of superiority was gone. He was no longer the confident judge calling the shots. Today, he looked a little uneasy. Perhaps it was the memory of Clint's sharp response from yesterday, or maybe it was the growing realization that Clint wasn't just here to sit quietly. Whatever it was, McAllister was less self-assured, and Clint couldn't help but notice it. Rachel gave him a subtle nod from the defense table. Clint returned it, the briefest flash of a smile crossing his face. She knew what was coming, and they both knew it would be a game changer. The key to this case, Clint realized, wasn't necessarily proving he was innocent, it was proving McAllister was biased, unfair, and ultimately unfit to preside over the case. If he could turn the judge's credibility into the central issue, everything else would fall into place. Judge McAllister called the court to order with his usual command, but there was something different about his tone. "Mr. Eastwood, I trust you've had enough time to consider your position," he asked, his voice laced with a subtle challenge. Clint's response was immediate and measured. "I've had enough time to understand that this isn't about the facts, Your Honor. It's about personal bias." McAllister's face darkened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Clint said, his tone unwavering. "You've made it clear from the start that you don't think I belong here. From the moment I walked into this courtroom, you've been treating me like I'm just some actor trying to play a part. But this isn't a movie. This is my life, and I'm not going to let anyone, especially you, make assumptions about me." The courtroom was dead silent. Every pair of eyes was on Clint as he spoke, and for the first time since the trial began, McAllister seemed to be at a loss for words. It wasn't just Clint's words that struck a chord, it was the conviction in his voice, the calm but fierce confidence that he wasn't backing down. McAllister finally regained his composure, his voice still steady but with an edge of frustration. "You will not question my ability to preside over this trial, Mr. Eastwood." "I'm not questioning your ability," Clint responded. "I'm questioning your impartiality. You've made it clear that you see me as someone who's above the law, and you're treating this case like it's some kind of spectacle." McAllister's jaw clenched, but Clint didn't stop. "I'm not here to entertain you or the court. I'm here because I've been wronged, and I'm going to fight for the truth. You, on the other hand, have been more interested in making this personal." Clint's words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in the trial, the judge seemed genuinely unsettled. It was clear that Clint had struck a nerve, and he wasn't about to let up. This wasn't just about fighting for his innocence, it was about showing the court, the public, and most importantly, Judge McAllister, that Clint Eastwood wasn't someone you could easily dismiss. He wasn't just a celebrity or a former action hero, he was a force to be reckoned with, both in the courtroom and in life. McAllister's hand gripped the gavel, but he said nothing. The courtroom held its breath, unsure of how the judge would respond. Then, Clint did something unexpected, he took a step forward. It was a subtle move, but one that sent a clear message. Clint wasn't backing down, and he wasn't afraid. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice cold and calculated, "I think it's time we move this case forward. The people here deserve justice, and I'm going to make sure they get it. But you need to step aside if you can't give them a fair hearing." A beat of silence passed, and then McAllister slammed the gavel down with authority. "Enough, Mr. Eastwood. We will proceed with the trial as scheduled." But everyone in the courtroom knew, things had changed. Clint had just made his first move, and McAllister's grip on control had begun to slip. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The previous day's exchange had left the judge seething and the spectators in stunned silence. Clint Eastwood's audacious confrontation had shaken the very foundation of the trial. Now, as the courtroom reconvened, there was a new tension, a quiet hum of expectation. Clint walked into the courtroom, his expression unreadable, but his mind was razor-sharp. Today would be different. Today, he was going to do more than just challenge McAllister's authority, he was going to expose the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. But more importantly, he was going to break the illusion that the judge had so carefully built around his own sense of infallibility. As Clint took his seat at the defense table, Rachel Collins shot him a quick glance. Her eyebrows arched, a silent question on her face. She knew Clint's style, always unorthodox, always bold, but even she couldn't help wondering what he had up his sleeve. It was clear that the last few days had been a calculated play, but what was the endgame? The courtroom was quieter than usual as Judge McAllister entered, his face a study in stoic fury. The gavel came down with force, and the judge's eyes briefly flicked over to Clint, who returned the gaze with unwavering intensity. There was no longer any pretense of cordiality between them. Clint was no longer just a defendant, he had become McAllister's adversary. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, his voice clipped, "I trust you've had time to reconsider your approach. We will proceed today with the case in a manner that is both efficient and respectful." Clint didn't flinch. He simply leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. Efficiency and respect are two things that seem to be in short supply in this courtroom, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but laced with just enough bite to make the room go still. McAllister's eyes narrowed. "Let's not waste time with petty remarks, Mr. Eastwood." "Petty?" Clint repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Is it petty to question the fairness of this trial? Because that's what we're here to talk about, right? Fairness. Impartiality. Justice." The room was silent as everyone turned their attention to Clint, wondering what he would say next. There was no mistaking it, Clint Eastwood wasn't here to simply defend himself. He was here to redefine the terms of the entire trial. The prosecution stood, ready to continue their argument, but Clint held up a hand, cutting them off mid-sentence. "Before we go any further," Clint said, his tone calm yet commanding, "there's something you need to know. Something that I think this court has missed." He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. He walked to the center of the courtroom, where the judge's bench stood, and without a hint of hesitation, he turned to face McAllister directly. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice now deep and resonant, "I've spent the last few days observing you. Not just as a judge, but as a man. And I've come to realize something that I think you need to hear. You're not impartial. You're not fair. You've been clouded by your own ego, and your bias is clear." The impact of Clint's words hit the room like a bombshell. The silence that followed felt thick and heavy, the tension palpable. The judge stiffened in his seat, his expression darkening. But Clint wasn't finished. "Yesterday, you made it clear that you didn't care much for my reputation or my past," Clint continued, his voice unwavering. "You've treated me as though I'm just another celebrity who doesn't belong in this courtroom. But let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the truth. Because you're missing something crucial here. This case isn't about my image. It's about whether or not I've been wrongfully accused, and whether or not I've been treated fairly." He turned his gaze to the jury. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what this trial should be about. It's not about the flashy headlines or the easy narrative. It's about whether or not I'm guilty of what they say I am. And I'll tell you right now, there's no evidence to support their claims." Clint paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for justice. The same justice that everyone in this courtroom is entitled to. And I'm asking you, Your Honor, to recuse yourself from this case. Because the moment you allowed your personal bias to take over, you lost the right to decide my fate." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the tension that had been building for days now coming to a head. Rachel's hand shot up to her mouth in disbelief. Even the prosecution looked stunned, their mouths agape. But Clint wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't here to win friends, he was here to win the trial. McAllister's face was a study in fury, his hands gripping the edges of his bench as though he might break it in half. But Clint didn't flinch. He held the judge's gaze, waiting for the inevitable response. "You've made your point, Mr. Eastwood," McAllister said through clenched teeth. "But I assure you, this court will proceed as planned. You will not dictate the course of these proceedings." Clint's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of triumph, it was the smile of a man who had seen through his opponent's facade and knew the truth. He had given McAllister the chance to back down, to do the right thing. But now, Clint was playing for keeps. And McAllister had made the mistake of underestimating him. "Fine," Clint said, his voice low and steady. "If that's how you want to play it, Your Honor, then I guess we'll let the truth speak for itself. But just know this, I will not back down." The room was tense, the air electric. Clint's declaration had not only set the stage for the final showdown, it had shattered McAllister's illusion of control. This was no longer a trial about business deals or legal technicalities. This was a trial about justice itself. And Clint had just proven that he was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. As Clint returned to his seat, his heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. He had just turned the tide, and now, the game was on. The weight of Clint's words hung heavy in the courtroom, each one reverberating in the minds of those who had been watching, waiting for the next move. As Clint settled back into his seat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, the silence almost oppressive. The judge's gavel had come down with a deafening bang, signifying the break before they resumed proceedings. But the tension remained thick in the air, and for a moment, Clint allowed himself a deep breath. It wasn't just McAllister who was rattled, Clint could see it in the faces of the jury too. Some looked uncomfortable, as though they had just been forced to consider something they hadn't planned to. Others looked uncertain, like they were reconsidering everything they had heard so far. But Clint had made his move, and now it was time to let the wheels of justice begin to turn. As the court recessed, Clint didn't make a move immediately. He needed to strategize, to plan the next phase of his defense. It wasn't enough just to rattle McAllister's cage, he had to exploit the cracks that had opened up, to turn them into an advantage. But as Clint stood and walked toward the back of the courtroom, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Eastwood." He turned. It was Rachel, his lawyer, her face a mask of professionalism, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that didn't quite belong. "What's going on?" Clint asked, his voice low. Rachel glanced around quickly, as though checking to see if anyone could overhear. "I think you just made a powerful move," she said, but her tone was tinged with something else, something deeper. "But there's something you need to know. Someone on the inside is on your side." Clint raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've never met a judge who would side with me." Rachel hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the judge's bench. "It's not the judge. It's someone on the jury." Clint's curiosity piqued. "Go on." Rachel leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "One of the jurors, Jessica Warren, has been sending signals to me. She's been paying extra attention to the inconsistencies in the prosecutor's case. I've seen her watching the judge more closely than anyone else. It's like she's trying to see through his facade." Clint's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. Jessica Warren. He didn't know her personally, but the mention of her name triggered something in his memory. A name like hers, he remembered, was often associated with keen judgment and a quiet but razor-sharp intelligence. She'd been a prosecutor before she became a juror, a formidable one. And Clint had a feeling that she wasn't as easily swayed as the others in the room. "Can you trust her?" Clint asked. "I think so," Rachel said, her voice tight. "She's been careful, but I've noticed the way she's been observing everything, especially the judge. She's not as taken in by his authority as the others." Clint nodded. "We need to keep an eye on her. If she's with us, then maybe we have a chance of breaking through the rest of this mess." As Rachel moved off to speak with the rest of the defense team, Clint stood there, thinking through the implications of this new revelation. If he could win Jessica over, then that might be the key to tilting the scales of justice in his favor. But it was a risk, he didn't know how far Jessica was willing to go or what her true allegiances were. Clint knew one thing for sure, he needed to get back into the courtroom. The time for waiting was over. He had to press forward. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation anymore, he was fighting for a greater truth. The court reconvened after the break, and Clint took his place at the defense table once more, his eyes scanning the room. He looked at McAllister, who seemed to be trying his best to project an air of control, but Clint could see it in his eyes, there was uncertainty now. McAllister was no longer the invincible judge who could push people around without consequence. He was a man on edge, and Clint intended to keep him there. Rachel was already whispering with her team, coordinating their next steps. They had been preparing for this moment. Now, it was time for Clint to use every bit of his strategic brilliance to make his next move. But the surprise came from an unexpected source. As the trial resumed, Jessica Warren, the juror whom Clint had barely given any thought to, stood up. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as all eyes turned toward her. She looked calm, composed, and yet there was something resolute about her demeanor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I would like to request a short recess. There are concerns among the jury about certain inconsistencies in the case, and we believe that further investigation may be required." McAllister blinked, clearly caught off guard by her sudden intervention. "Are you suggesting that the jury is unable to continue with the deliberations?" he asked, his tone sharp. Jessica didn't flinch. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for a brief pause so we can review the evidence more thoroughly." It's important that we get this right. The judge's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face. This is highly irregular. The jury is to remain impartial. We are, Jessica replied calmly. But impartiality also means ensuring that we're not overlooking any crucial information. A recess will allow us to review what's been presented more carefully. Clint couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was exactly the opening they needed. His heart began to race as the realization hit him: Jessica was playing the long game, and she was on their side. McAllister hesitated, his fingers tapping against his gavel as he processed the request. Finally, with a begrudging sigh, he gave the nod. "Very well," McAllister said, his voice strained. "The court will recess for 30 minutes. We'll resume shortly." As the court emptied, Clint caught Jessica's eye. There was no visible sign of acknowledgement, but he could see it: she was on his side. Rachel walked over to Clint, her expression full of surprise and admiration. "I didn't see that coming," she whispered. Clint allowed himself a rare, small smile. "Neither did I. But we're not out of the woods yet. This is just the beginning." And with that, Clint Eastwood's battle for justice took another crucial step forward. The truth, it seemed, was finally starting to come into focus. The brief recess was a whirlwind. Clint paced the courtroom hallway, his mind racing, but his steps measured. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and yet, Clint knew this was the moment he had been working toward. Everything had led to this point: the confrontation with the judge, the subtle alliance with Jessica, and the strategy that had kept McAllister off balance. Clint's thoughts were interrupted as Rachel approached him, a slight but unmistakable smile on her face. "It worked," she said simply. Jessica's request for the recess threw McAllister off. He didn't expect the jury to take charge like that. Clint nodded, but his mind was already working through the next move. "That's only one part of the puzzle. We need to be ready for what comes next. McAllister is not going to let this go easily." Rachel glanced toward the courtroom door, where the sound of footsteps echoed. The 30-minute break was over. They had no more time to strategize. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice low but filled with determination. Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression calm but with an underlying intensity. He knew this was his moment to shine, his last chance to turn everything around. "I've been ready for this since the first day of the trial," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Now, let's finish this." The two of them walked back into the courtroom, where the atmosphere was different. The air felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for the next dramatic turn. Clint could see McAllister sitting at the bench, his fingers steepled together, clearly stewing over the surprise intervention by Jessica. The judge was already plotting his next move, Clint could tell, but it didn't matter. McAllister had underestimated the depth of Clint's resolve. "Court is now back in session," McAllister announced, his voice laced with frustration, but also an undertone of forced composure. He glanced briefly at Jessica Warren, who sat with a quiet confidence, not giving anything away. Clint returned to his seat, his body relaxed, but his mind was firing on all cylinders. The final play had arrived, and everything depended on how they moved from here. Rachel leaned over to Clint. "Now's the time. We've got Jessica in our corner, and we've got the jury paying attention. We need to push McAllister into a corner." Clint nodded, watching as McAllister signaled the prosecutor to continue. The trial, once again, was moving forward, but this time, Clint wasn't just a defendant. He was the one in control of the narrative. The prosecutor stood and began to present more of the so-called evidence against Clint, but Clint wasn't listening. Instead, his mind was already working on his counterattack. He waited for the perfect moment, biding his time like a lion poised to strike. And then it came. "Objection, Your Honor," Clint called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the prosecutor's speech. Everyone turned to him, surprise on their faces. Clint stood slowly, taking his time. He wasn't in a hurry. The courtroom, if anything, was in his grasp now. You can't just present this as evidence without properly verifying its source, Clint said coolly, addressing the judge directly. His voice wasn't raised, but the words were sharp, filled with the precision of someone who had spent years studying every little detail of the law. You're trying to present this as a key piece of the case against me, but you haven't even verified the chain of custody. This is inadmissible. The room went silent. Rachel, who had been ready to speak, was momentarily caught off guard by Clint's swift maneuver. The jury shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between Clint and the judge. McAllister's expression darkened. "Mr. Eastwood, you're out of line. The prosecution's evidence is perfectly valid." Clint shook his head. "No, Your Honor. It's not. And it's time to stop pretending it is." Clint's words reverberated through the courtroom, and for the first time in the trial, Clint saw cracks in McAllister's armor. The judge's hand tightened around the gavel, his knuckles whitening. "Objection overruled," McAllister said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He knew Clint had just played a winning hand. The crowd murmured, the tension building to a fever pitch. Clint turned to the jury, his face calm, but his words cutting through the silence like a hot knife through butter. "You've been presented with half-truths," Clint said, his voice ringing out with the force of undeniable truth. "And now, we're seeing what happens when those lies begin to unravel. This trial is a game of smoke and mirrors, and I'm the one here to expose the truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the jury. "I'm not asking you to believe me because I'm Clint Eastwood. I'm asking you to believe me because the facts, the real facts, are on my side." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Clint thought he could see the first glimmer of doubt in the prosecutor's eyes. The atmosphere had shifted once more. This wasn't about the case anymore, it was about the truth. As the room settled, McAllister's voice rang out again, but this time it lacked the usual confidence. "The jury will deliberate," he said tightly. "We'll reconvene after a brief recess." The gavel came down once more, signaling the temporary end of the day's proceedings. Clint felt his pulse quicken as he returned to the defense table. The jury had seen what needed to be seen. He had made his case, and now, it was in their hands. "I think we just did it," Rachel whispered, her voice laced with hope. But before he could reflect too long, he was interrupted by a soft voice. "Mr. Eastwood, if I may." Clint turned toward Jessica Warren. She had remained seated throughout the entire exchange, but now, she was looking directly at him, her expression unreadable. "I think it's time for you to prepare for the final verdict," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than anyone could know. "You've just won this." Clint met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "We'll see," he said softly, though in his heart, he knew. The final play had been made, and now the endgame was near. The wait was agonizing. Clint Eastwood sat motionless at the defense table, his hands folded tightly before him. His gaze remained steady, focused, despite the constant hum of anxiety that filled the room. The jury had been deliberating for what felt like an eternity, and with every passing minute, the weight of their decision bore down heavier on him. This was it, the moment he had been fighting for, clawing his way through this labyrinth of deceit and corruption. He had come so far, but it was still far from certain. Rachel sat beside him, her face a mask of professionalism, but Clint knew she was just as anxious as he was. The tension was palpable in the air, even the courtroom's usually indifferent security guards couldn't mask their growing unease. The entire room, filled with spectators, lawyers, and court staff, was holding its breath. "Mr. Eastwood," the bailiff's voice echoed through the room, cutting through the silence like a blade. "The jury has reached a verdict." Clint stood up, his legs feeling heavy, as though the very weight of the trial had become a physical force pulling him down. Rachel stood beside him, her hand briefly touching his arm, a gesture of silent solidarity. It was strange. There was no joy, no sense of celebration. The calm before the storm felt more like a haunting finality. The judge, who had been sitting behind the bench with his expression unreadable, called for the jury to be brought into the courtroom. His gavel fell, the sound like thunder in Clint's chest. As the jury entered, Clint's heart rate quickened, and his breath grew shallow. They filed into their seats, their faces solemn, almost all of them avoiding Clint's gaze. Jessica Warren, however, sat upright, her eyes meeting Clint's for a brief second. There was something there, an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that the battle wasn't over yet, but it had been hard won. McAllister's eyes, cold and calculating, shifted between Clint and the jury, sensing something in the air. It wasn't just the case that hung in the balance, it was his reputation. If the jury delivered a verdict in Clint's favor, his carefully constructed position of power would come crashing down. The foreperson of the jury, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, stood. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale in unison. Everyone knew this moment had arrived, the culmination of weeks of legal drama. "Your Honor," the foreperson began, her voice steady but firm. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Clint Eastwood, not guilty on all counts." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Clint's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he felt suspended in time, as if the words had not yet reached his brain. Not guilty. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some of disbelief, others of triumph. Clint could hear his heartbeat in his ears, pounding in rhythm with the realization that he had just won. He had beaten the system, taken on a corrupt judge, an overzealous prosecutor, and emerged victorious. Rachel's hand gripped his arm firmly, but it wasn't to calm him, it was a gesture of shared relief, shared victory. For all the nights of planning, the moments of doubt, and the risks they had taken together, it had all led to this. Clint turned, his face breaking into a smile for the first time in what seemed like forever. But it wasn't just relief, it was the satisfaction of justice. It was the feeling that, against all odds, truth had prevailed. "Clint." Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it." But Clint wasn't listening. His eyes were on the jury, and more specifically, Jessica Warren. He could see her eyes flicker with quiet satisfaction. Clint's gaze softened, and he gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. He knew that without her pivotal decision in the jury room to take charge, this victory might have slipped through his fingers. The judge banged his gavel, his voice booming through the chaos that followed. "Order in the court." The noise died down, but the moment felt eternal, like the entire courtroom was suspended in a sense of awe at what had just occurred. McAllister, his face tight with barely suppressed anger, stood up from his bench, but no words came from his lips. He was defeated, and it was clear that this was a moment of reckoning for him. Clint had managed to do what many thought impossible, he had turned the tables on McAllister, and the truth had been revealed. Clint turned to face the judge, his voice calm, but laden with the weight of the victory. "I hope this trial serves as a reminder that justice cannot be bought. The truth will always find a way." The judge didn't respond, though Clint could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. It was as if the judge knew that his days of wielding unchallenged authority in that courtroom were numbered. Rachel stepped closer to Clint, placing her hand on his shoulder. "What now?" she asked, her voice low but filled with respect. Clint's gaze shifted to the prosecutor, who was standing rigidly at the opposing table, clearly stewing in his defeat. Clint could almost hear the thoughts racing through the prosecutor's mind, how could he have miscalculated so thoroughly? Clint straightened himself, his confidence now fully restored. "Now, we make sure that no one ever forgets what happened here," he said, his voice filled with a quiet but palpable intensity. "Justice may have been done today, but we can't let the system go back to the way it was before. We keep fighting." Rachel looked at him, her expression softening, a smile tugging at her lips. "I think you've made your point, Clint. You're not just a survivor. You're a force to be reckoned with." Clint's eyes narrowed, his jaw set in determination. This isn't over yet. We've only just begun. The applause from the courtroom spectators was loud, a roar of approval for the decision that had just been handed down. But for Clint, the victory was sweet, yes, but it wasn't the end. The road ahead was still long, still filled with challenges. The corrupt system he had exposed wasn't going to fix itself overnight. It was going to take more than just this one case to bring about true change. But for now, Clint allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had won. The odds had been stacked against him, and yet, here he stood, victorious. As he left the courtroom, his thoughts turned to the future, and to the one thing that had always driven him, the pursuit of truth. With Jessica's quiet alliance, Rachel's unwavering dedication, and his own genius legal skills, Clint knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by the system. And this battle was far from over. The aftermath of the trial unfolded with a mix of relief, reflection, and the stirring realization that Clint Eastwood's battle was far from over. The streets outside the courthouse were a blur of reporters, cameras, and eager onlookers. The weight of the public's gaze was heavy, but Clint, ever the master of composure, walked with the quiet confidence that had carried him through the most grueling fight of his life. "Clint, Clint," shouted a reporter, pushing through the crowd to reach him. "How does it feel to have cleared your name?" The camera flashes went off in a flurry, but Clint's eyes were already elsewhere, as if already moving beyond the moment. He didn't need the applause. The victory was his, quietly, cleanly, and undeniably. But now, it was about what came next. Beside him, Rachel moved through the crowd with purpose, guiding Clint toward a waiting car. "We need to get you out of here. The media is already starting to spin their own version of events." Clint barely acknowledged the press, his mind still processing the weight of the trial, the revelations, and the personal cost it had exacted on him. As much as he wanted to savor the sweet taste of victory, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. His victory in the courtroom was a beacon, but it also made him a target. The forces that had tried to silence him were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The car ride to Clint's apartment was a quiet one. Rachel sat next to him, her eyes trained on the road, but Clint could sense the shift in their dynamic. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had been through something extraordinary together. As the car pulled up to his building, Clint finally broke the silence. "You did good in there, Rachel. I couldn't have done this without you." Rachel turned to him, a modest smile on her face. "I just helped keep things on track. You were the one who turned the tide, Clint. You saw things no one else did." Clint's gaze softened. "I had to. McAllister wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous. This trial wasn't just about me, it was about exposing a system that lets people like him get away with murder." Rachel nodded, her expression turning serious. "That's exactly why this won't be the last fight you'll have to face. The people who are behind all of this, they're not going to let you just walk away." Clint took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he thought about what lay ahead. "I know. But they won't win, Rachel. Not now. Not after everything that's been revealed. It's not just about me anymore. It's about taking down the people who think they're untouchable." As they entered Clint's apartment, the quiet, simple space felt oddly comforting after the chaos of the trial. The familiar surroundings were a reminder of the life he had before all of this began, a life he had almost lost. But he wouldn't be returning to the same life. The trial, the revelations, the media firestorm, it had all changed him. He sat down on the couch, his eyes scanning the room. His life had been a series of battles, both in and out of the courtroom. But this one, this trial, this fight, had been different. He had come face to face with the darker side of justice, and he had won. But the victory was bittersweet. There were more fights to come. The kind of battles that went beyond legal strategy and courtroom tactics. The kind of battles that could change the world. Rachel took a seat across from him, her eyes searching his face. What's next, Clint? What do you plan to do now that the trial is over? Clint's gaze shifted to the window, where the first light of the evening sun cast long shadows across the city. He thought about the years of legal practice, the cases he'd handled, and the truth he had always fought for. But he also thought about the families, the victims, the people who had been wronged in ways he could no longer ignore. I'm not done, he said quietly, his voice steady, but with a resolve that was growing stronger by the second. This trial was just the beginning. Now that people know the truth, I can't walk away. There are too many others out there who need help, people who don't have a voice, people who are silenced by the system. Rachel nodded. And you're going to help them? Clint met her gaze. I've always helped people, Rachel. But now I'm going to do it on my terms. I'm going to take the fight to the people who have been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings behind the scenes. They think they're above the law, but they're wrong. It's time to hold them accountable. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. Clint had fought for his own freedom, but now he was ready to fight for something more, a fight that would demand everything from him, a fight that would take him places he couldn't yet imagine. Rachel stood up, her expression a mix of admiration and understanding. You're going to need allies. There's a lot of work to do. Clint nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I've got one. And that's all I need. His eyes shifted to the door, where Jessica Warren had appeared, stepping into the apartment with a quiet confidence. Her eyes met Clint's, and for a moment, everything else faded. It was as if the battle, the courtroom, and even the stakes of what was to come had faded into the background. The unspoken connection between them was undeniable. You look like you've got a plan, Jessica said, her voice calm but tinged with something more, something that spoke to a shared understanding, a silent pact forged in the fires of the courtroom. Clint stood, moving toward her. I do. And I could use your help. Jessica gave a small smile, one that spoke volumes. You've got it. The pieces were falling into place. Clint had come out of the courtroom victorious, but the real fight was just beginning. The corruption, the deceit, the lies that had stained the system, Clint knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. But now he had something he hadn't had before, allies, a purpose, and a resolve that wouldn't be shaken. And in that moment, Clint Eastwood realized that the real victory was not in the courtroom. It was in the journey ahead, the one that would shape not only his future, but the future of justice itself. The city felt different now. It wasn't just the weight of the trial behind him, nor the roar of victory that echoed in his mind. Clint Eastwood had been a lawyer for most of his life, but what he had just experienced was far beyond any case he'd ever taken on. The aftermath was a strange feeling, part relief, part uncertainty. Clint knew what he had to do. His life had been shaped by his experiences in the courtroom, but he had never felt this much pressure to act. He had won, yes, but the fight had opened his eyes to a darker truth. The system wasn't just flawed, it was broken. And it needed to be fixed. He leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the papers scattered before him. Each sheet contained names, dates, and unsettling truths. He had started to gather evidence of systemic corruption, individuals pulling strings in the shadows, and it had become clear that his battle wasn't just about one corrupt judge or a failed trial. There were entire networks at play, ones that Clint had been blind to until now. Rachel had been right, he couldn't walk away. But the stakes had just gone through the roof. If he was going to continue this fight, he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. And not just any help, he needed people who weren't afraid of the power he was up against. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down to see a text from Jessica Warren, "We need to talk. Meet me at the diner." Clint's lips curled into a faint smile. Jessica had been there from the start. Without her, the trial might have gone a very different way. Her quiet leadership in the jury room had been instrumental, and Clint had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't anticipated. The diner wasn't far, and within 20 minutes, Clint was sitting across from Jessica in a small booth, the warm glow of overhead lights casting a soft, golden hue over their conversation. Jessica was the first to speak. "You know we can't let this go, right? There's too much at stake." Clint took a sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "I know. That's why I need you. We can't keep fighting this alone." He paused, eyes meeting hers, searching for understanding. "I need your help to take down what we started. But we're talking bigger than just McAllister. This is going deeper than we thought." Jessica leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "I figured as much. But that's not something we can do with just the two of us, Clint. You need allies who are more than just legal minds. We need people who can go toe-to-toe with the kind of power we're dealing with." Clint's mind immediately turned to the people he knew. He had a handful of trusted colleagues, some former clients, and a few who owed him favors from cases he had worked on over the years. But Jessica was right. This would take more than legal know-how. It would take people with connections, resources, and the courage to stand up to those who believed they were untouchable. "I've got a few people in mind," Clint said, his voice low. "But I need someone on the inside, someone who knows the system better than anyone else." Jessica paused, her lips pressed together in thought. "You're not asking for the impossible, are you?" Clint grinned. "I never ask for anything easy." Jessica laughed quietly, her eyes softening. "You're going to need to trust these people completely, Clint. We don't know who's on our side yet, and we definitely don't know who's working against us." "I know," Clint replied, his voice turning serious again. "But I've been in this game long enough to know that trust is a currency that's in short supply. I'm not sure who we can rely on just yet, but we're going to need to make some bold moves if we want to succeed." The sound of clinking dishes and murmurs from other diners filled the space between them as the weight of their conversation hung in the air. Jessica finally broke the silence. "I think we should start with someone I know, someone who owes me a favor. He's been working in the DA's office for years. If anyone knows how the system works from the inside out, it's him. His name's Alex. He's cautious, but if we play this right, we might be able to leverage his knowledge." Clint thought for a moment, then nodded. "Alex. Okay. Let's see what we can get from him. But we move carefully. We can't afford to make mistakes." Jessica agreed, her tone becoming more resolute. "Exactly. But we also need to make sure we're not getting in too deep. These people are dangerous, Clint. If we go after the wrong people, we could end up in a much worse situation." The conversation turned toward strategy, and for the first time in a while, Clint felt the spark of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Jessica was with him, and if she had the right connections, they might just have a shot at uncovering the truth behind the web of corruption that had remained hidden for so long. As the evening wore on, Clint felt a familiar energy return, a feeling he hadn't had since the trial started. This was no longer just a fight for his freedom. This was a fight for something bigger, a fight for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the system as a whole. After they finished their meal, Clint stood and offered Jessica a nod. "Let's go get Alex. We'll need him on our side if we're going to bring this whole thing down." Jessica stood as well, her face thoughtful. "And we'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." They walked out of the diner, the cool night air biting at their skin. Clint had the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could predict. But he was ready. He had no choice but to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The air felt different now, charged with tension and a sense of urgency that Clint hadn't experienced in a long time. The battle was no longer just about a courtroom, or even about one corrupt individual. It was about toppling a whole network, a machine of lies and manipulation that had long thrived in the shadows. Clint wasn't naive, he knew the risks. But he couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. Clint and Jessica had agreed to meet Alex at a small, inconspicuous cafe, far from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. They couldn't afford any slip-ups, not when they were about to take the first steps toward infiltrating the very system they were fighting against. The conversation with Alex had to be handled delicately. One wrong move, and they could find themselves back at square one, or worse, on the wrong side of the law. They arrived early, both trying to mask their nerves beneath cool, calculated exteriors. Clint surveyed the cafe's dimly lit interior, his eyes scanning for any sign of a trap. He couldn't help but wonder, was this all part of a bigger play? Were they being watched? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the belly of the beast. Jessica leaned over and whispered, "Alex should be here any minute." Clint nodded, adjusting his jacket and watching the door. "I hope he's ready for what we're about to ask." The minutes ticked by, each one adding to the mounting sense of anticipation. Clint's mind raced, thinking through all the possible outcomes. Alex was their inside man, but he was also a wild card. The DA's office was no place for someone to make waves, especially not with the kind of people Clint suspected were pulling strings behind the scenes. Finally, the door opened, and a man entered. Clint's eyes immediately locked onto him. Alex was tall, in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a look of quiet intelligence that spoke of years of experience in the field. His eyes darted around the room, cautious but calculating, before he spotted Jessica and Clint at the corner booth. Jessica stood, giving him a brief, firm handshake. "Thanks for meeting us, Alex." Clint followed suit, his expression neutral but focused. "We appreciate you taking the time." Alex nodded, sliding into the seat across from them. "I know this is important," he said quietly, looking at Jessica, then Clint. "What's going on? You said this was bigger than the McAllister case. What exactly are we dealing with here?" Clint took a deep breath, locking eyes with Alex. "We're dealing with a system that's been broken for a long time. The corruption isn't isolated. It's embedded, deeply entrenched in the very core of the justice system. McAllister was just the tip of the iceberg. There are people who think they're untouchable. Powerful people who have been controlling things from behind the scenes." Alex leaned back in his chair, processing Clint's words. "And you think you can take them down?" Jessica jumped in. "We can. But we need your help. You know this system better than anyone, Alex. We need inside information, files, documents, anything you can give us that'll expose the truth." The weight of the request hung in the air, and for a long moment, Alex didn't respond. He glanced around the cafe, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. Clint could tell he was weighing his options. The danger of what they were asking was palpable. One wrong move, and Alex could lose everything, his career, his freedom, possibly even his life. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice low. "I'm in. But you need to understand that this won't be easy. We're talking about some heavy hitters, people who don't just control the system, but people who control the narrative. If we're going to go after them, we need to be smart. We can't afford to get sloppy." Clint's heart raced. This was the moment. Alex was on their side, but the real work was just beginning. "What's the first step?" Clint asked, his voice steady. Alex paused, looking over his shoulder one last time before pulling a small folder from his bag and sliding it across the table. "This is just a start," he said. "It's not much, but it's a glimpse into the people we're dealing with. The connections go deep. I've been collecting information for a while now, quietly. I can't do more than this without drawing attention. But this." He tapped the folder. "This will show you who you're really up against." Clint opened the folder cautiously. Inside, there were several documents, a few names, and a list of phone numbers that immediately caught his attention. These people. They're connected to McAllister, aren't they? Clint asked, studying the names closely. Alex nodded, his voice barely a whisper. McAllister is just a pawn. These people are much bigger. The names on those documents. They've been pulling strings in the shadows for decades. Some of them are judges. Some are in law enforcement. Some are even involved in politics. They've got it all covered. Jessica glanced at Clint, her expression hardening. So it's worse than we thought. Clint exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He'd always known the system was flawed, but this was something else entirely. The people they were up against weren't just criminals, they were part of a deeply embedded network that was protected at all costs. Clint knew that taking them down wouldn't just be a matter of uncovering the truth, it would require careful strategy, patience, and allies they hadn't yet identified. Alex spoke again, pulling Clint from his thoughts. You need to be careful. There are people watching me, people who know what I'm up to. I can't give you more without risking everything. Clint nodded. We understand. But this is a start. We'll take it from here. We'll be in touch. As Alex left the cafe, Clint and Jessica sat in silence for a moment, processing the gravity of what had just transpired. They had the first piece of the puzzle, but the road ahead was long and dangerous. The system wasn't just broken, it was actively working against them. Jessica looked at Clint, her voice steady but filled with determination. We have to stay ahead of them, Clint. We can't let them know we're onto them. They'll do anything to protect themselves. Clint nodded, his gaze fixed on the folder in front of him. We'll be ready. But this is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go. With that, the next phase of their plan began to take shape. The battle was no longer just about one trial, one case, or one corrupt judge. It was a fight for the soul of the entire justice system, and Clint Eastwood was ready to face it head-on. The feeling of uncertainty still hung in the air. As Clint drove through the night toward his office, he couldn't shake the images of the documents Alex had given him. The names on those pages weren't just people, they were a list of puppeteers, controlling the strings of a broken system that Clint had spent his career fighting to improve. They were powerful, influential, and deeply embedded in the structures he had spent years working within. Clint had always prided himself on knowing the law, understanding its nuances and how to work the system to get the best results. But what Alex had shown him made Clint realize just how little he truly knew. These weren't just criminals operating outside the law, these people were the law. And the stakes had just skyrocketed. Jessica had gone home for the night, but Clint couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. What could they do with this information? How far would they have to go to bring this web of corruption into the light? The next steps weren't clear, but Clint knew one thing, they couldn't afford to wait. The longer they stayed silent, the more the system would keep functioning as it always had, unchecked, unchallenged, and untouchable. He arrived at his office and sat at his desk, staring at the folder. He flipped through the pages again, committing every name and every connection to memory. There were several familiar names, judges he'd argued before, law enforcement officials who had been both allies and adversaries in his past cases. But there were others he'd never heard of, figures who were clearly operating in the shadows, pulling strings in ways that Clint couldn't fully understand. One name stood out above the rest, William "Bill" Harper. Clint recognized the name immediately. Harper was a judge who had been sitting on the bench for over 2 decades. He was known for his hard stance on crime, but behind the gavel, rumors swirled that Harper had questionable ties to some of the most notorious figures in the city. The problem was, those rumors had always been just that, rumors. There was no concrete proof, nothing that could bring Harper down. Until now. Clint pulled up his phone and dialed Jessica's number. "Hey, Clint. What's up?" she answered, her voice sounding more awake than he expected, considering the late hour. "We need to meet," Clint said, his voice urgent. "I think I've found the key to all of this." Jessica didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." The next day, Clint and Jessica sat at their usual booth in the diner, the air thick with the weight of the conversation they were about to have. Clint slid the file across the table, the name Bill Harper clearly visible on top. "I think Harper is the linchpin," Clint said. "He's been involved in cases that could bring down a lot of the people we're looking for. But more importantly, he's been covering for them. If we can take him down, it's going to open up a whole new avenue of information." Jessica studied the name, her brow furrowing. "Harper's dangerous, Clint. He's been around for a long time, and no one's ever been able to touch him. He's got too much power, too many connections. If we go after him, we need a solid plan." Clint nodded, pushing his coffee cup aside. "I know. That's why we need to be strategic. We can't just expose him without the right leverage. We need to find a way to connect him to the other names in the file, to show that he's not just a corrupt judge, but a key player in a much larger network." Jessica took a deep breath, looking around the diner cautiously. "We'll need more than just paper trails. We need people who've worked with him, witnesses who've seen what's been going on behind closed doors." Clint leaned in. "That's where Alex comes in. He's got a source inside the DA's office who might be able to help us. We can't go after Harper without the right evidence, but if Alex can get us something solid, we'll have our opening." Jessica's expression darkened. "This is getting riskier by the minute. We're talking about going after someone who could bring down everything we've worked for. If Harper catches wind of this, it's not just our careers at risk, it's our lives." Clint understood the danger, but he wasn't backing down. "I know, but this isn't just about us anymore. It's about taking down the whole system. People like Harper, people who think they're untouchable, need to be held accountable." There was a long pause as Jessica absorbed his words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. But we move carefully. No more mistakes." "Agreed," Clint replied, his tone firm. "We'll need to meet with Alex tomorrow. He's got to get us something concrete on Harper, something that can't be ignored." Jessica's gaze turned cold, focused. "Let's do it. But Clint, we need to be ready. This fight is bigger than we thought, and it's only going to get messier from here." Clint didn't flinch. "I've been through the fire before. I'm ready for whatever comes next." The following day, they met with Alex at a secure location, a nondescript office building in a quiet part of the city. Clint and Jessica sat across from him, waiting for the information that would either make or break their plan. Alex didn't waste time. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is it. I got into the archives and pulled what I could. It's not much, but it's enough to get you started." Clint opened the envelope carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside, there were files, court cases, emails, even photographs that linked Bill Harper to several known criminals and corrupt officials. But the most damning piece of evidence was a signed letter, detailing an illegal deal between Harper and a powerful real estate developer. The letter was a smoking gun, one that could blow the lid off everything. Clint's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the leverage they needed. "Good work, Alex," Clint said, his voice tight. "This changes everything." Jessica leaned in. "But we can't go public with this yet. We need to hold on to it and figure out how we're going to use it without getting ourselves killed." Alex looked at them both, his expression serious. "I'll keep digging. But you're right. If we're going to take down people like Harper, we need to be careful. The wrong move, and you won't just be fighting the system, you'll be fighting an army." Clint nodded, determined. "Then we make sure we're ready. No more waiting." As Clint left the office building, the weight of the files in his hands felt heavier than ever before. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. Bill Harper was just the beginning. But now, with the evidence they had, Clint felt a sense of purpose he hadn't had before. This fight wasn't just about a corrupt judge or a broken system. It was about changing everything, and Clint wasn't about to stop now. Clint's fingers gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing as he drove toward the quiet, secluded mansion on the outskirts of town. It had been a long few days since Alex had given them the damning evidence, and now, the tension was mounting. The next phase of the plan was in motion, but Clint knew the stakes were higher than ever. They had Harper, or at least they had a solid lead on him, but what if this was all just part of a much larger game? Jessica's words echoed in Clint's mind, "We can't go public yet. We need to hold on to it." Every move from here on out needed to be calculated. If they were going to take down Harper, they needed to get everything they could. They needed to know how deep the corruption ran. But with every moment they spent in the shadows, Clint felt the noose tightening. They were getting closer to the heart of this rotten system, but with every step, the danger escalated. The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. Clint had been here before, but it wasn't a place he visited often. The mansion belonged to Gerald Foster, a wealthy real estate developer whose name had popped up in the documents Alex had provided. Foster was well known in legal circles, but few understood just how far his reach extended. He was connected to a number of high-profile individuals, including Bill Harper. Clint had no doubt that Foster held the key to unlocking the rest of the puzzle. He parked the car in a secluded spot, making sure no one would notice him. The plan was simple: get in, gather any information he could, and get out. No room for mistakes. Jessica's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Clint, you sure about this?" "Yeah," Clint replied, his voice low. "We need to know everything Foster's hiding. He's part of this. I can feel it. You're walking into the lion's den, Clint. Be careful." "Always am," Clint muttered, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the estate. "I'll be in touch." With that, he slipped out of the car and made his way toward the mansion, moving quickly but cautiously. The night was quiet, too quiet. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every step he took seemed to echo in the silence, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this game. He approached the back of the mansion, where a service entrance offered the best chance of getting inside unnoticed. The security cameras were all pointed toward the front gate, so Clint took his chance, slipping through the side gate and toward the door. He had done this before, sneaking into places like this, gathering information, using every trick in his book to stay under the radar. But tonight felt different. The stakes were personal now. The door creaked open quietly, and Clint slipped inside. The interior of the mansion was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive leather. He moved through the halls quickly, making his way toward the study where he knew Foster often kept important documents. The place felt like a maze, each hallway leading to more expensive furniture, more ostentatious displays of wealth. But Clint's focus was singular: he needed to find what Foster was hiding, and he needed it now. As he neared the study, Clint heard voices in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was inside. He ducked into a nearby alcove, pressing his back against the wall and holding his breath. The voices grew louder as they approached, and Clint's mind raced. What are they talking about? The voices grew closer, and Clint could make out their words. "Harper's becoming a problem," one of the men said. Clint recognized the voice as that of Victor West, a notorious crime boss who had been involved in several high-profile cases Clint had worked on. West's reputation for ruthlessness was well known, and hearing his name only heightened Clint's sense of urgency. "Harper will be dealt with," Foster's voice replied, cold and calm. "We've got it under control. But we can't afford any more slip-ups. We have to keep things quiet for now. The feds are sniffing around, and we need to stay ahead of them." Clint felt a surge of adrenaline. Harper is a problem for them too. This was the break he needed. The information he was about to gather could finally connect all the dots. But he couldn't risk being caught. He waited, motionless, until the voices faded. Clint quickly moved toward the study, barely a whisper in the darkness. As he reached the door, he paused, listening for any sign that the men were still nearby. The last thing he needed was to get caught in the act. Slowly, he turned the door handle and slipped inside. The study was massive, lined with shelves of books, trophies, and expensive pieces of art. Clint's eyes scanned the room, landing on a large desk near the back wall. There, neatly organized in an open drawer, were several files. Clint's pulse quickened. This was it. He moved quickly, rifling through the papers. Most of it was business correspondence, nothing that seemed out of place. But then, he found something that made his heart race, a list of names, all of them connected to Harper, West, and a few others Clint didn't recognize. It was a roster of individuals, all involved in illegal activities, with notes detailing their roles and how they were connected to Foster and the others. Clint's fingers trembled as he grabbed the file, carefully closing the drawer behind him. He knew this was more than enough to expose the entire operation. But before he could leave, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks, a soft creak, as if someone had stepped into the room. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he turned, finding himself face to face with none other than Gerald Foster. His expression was calm, almost amused, as he looked Clint up and down. "I knew someone would come for it," Foster said, his voice smooth and almost mocking. "I just didn't know it'd be you, Clint." Clint's mind raced, calculating his next move. He didn't have much time, and the stakes had just gone through the roof. "I need to get out of here. Now." But before he could make a move, Foster's voice stopped him cold. "You're playing a dangerous game, my friend. But you're out of your league." Foster's smile was chilling. "If you're smart, you'll walk away. I can make sure your career, and your life, disappear without a trace." Clint met his gaze, refusing to back down. "You've already lost, Foster. This is bigger than you, and you can't stop it." Foster chuckled, but there was no humor in his laugh. "We'll see about that." Suddenly, the door to the study swung open behind Clint. He spun around just in time to see a pair of security guards step inside, guns drawn. "You've got two choices, Clint," Foster said, his voice low and deadly. "You can hand over the file and walk out of here with your life, or we can see how long you last before the system swallows you whole." Clint took a deep breath, eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. The noose was tightening, but Clint wasn't ready to give up, not now, not ever. "I don't think you understand, Foster," Clint said, his voice steely. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The sound of a gun being cocked echoed through the study like a chilling reminder of the danger Clint was in. He stood frozen, the file still clutched tightly in his hands, his mind racing. Foster's voice was a cold whisper in the stillness of the room, and the threat hung heavy in the air. "You've made a mistake, Clint," Foster said, his smile sinister. "Now you're going to regret it." Clint's eyes darted to the security guards who had just entered, their guns trained directly on him. The odds were stacked against him, two armed men, Foster watching from behind, and the file that could bring everything crashing down. He had to think fast. Without warning, Clint dropped the file onto the floor, kicked it toward the door, and made a sudden, unexpected move. The guards flinched, momentarily caught off guard by his audacity. It was just enough of a distraction for Clint to make his move. He darted toward the far corner of the study, taking advantage of the heavy drapes and large furniture to break their line of sight. "Don't let him escape," Foster shouted, his voice laced with fury. Clint's pulse raced, but his mind was clear. He wasn't going to give up the file, not now, not when they were so close. He had to make it out, and fast. He burst through the door into the hallway, moving at a dead run, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. He knew this house well enough from previous visits, and though his escape route was not set in stone, he had a few ideas on how to get out. As he rounded a corner, Clint could hear the guard's footsteps behind him, the sound of heavy boots pounding on the floor, growing closer. He reached a narrow hallway that led to a back staircase, the one area of the mansion where he could make his escape without being seen. His heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline surged through his veins. Clint glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the guards coming around the corner. They were gaining on him. But Clint was faster. He bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The only thing in his mind was getting to the rooftop. Once there, he could find a way down. He knew the mansion well enough to know there was a hidden fire escape, a safe way out without being seen. Behind him, he could hear the guards shouting, their voices distant but getting louder. But Clint was already thinking ahead. As he reached the top of the stairs, he dashed to the side, slipping behind a stack of old paintings that had been left leaning against the wall. He held his breath as the guards passed by, unaware of his presence. He didn't dare move, not yet. The seconds stretched out like minutes, but when the sound of footsteps faded, Clint exhaled slowly and crept to the rooftop access door. It creaked when he pushed it open, but Clint was too determined to care. He stepped outside into the cold night air, the city lights below twinkling like distant stars. Clint knew this was far from over, but at least for now, he had a brief window of time to plan his next move. He leaned against the railing, staring down at the mansion grounds below. His heart still raced, but he could feel the weight of the file in his hands. The evidence was real, and it was undeniable. Back at the diner, Jessica waited, her eyes scanning the door as she checked her watch for what felt like the 100th time. Clint had gone into the lion's den, and now she was stuck waiting for any sign that he was okay. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her heart sinking when she saw the number on the screen. It was Clint. Her thumb hovered over the call button as she debated whether or not to pick up. They had been through close calls before, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. Finally, she answered. Clint. Get to the rendezvous point, Clint said, his voice tight with urgency. I'll explain everything when I get there. Trust no one else. Jessica felt her stomach drop. What's happened? Are you okay? I'm fine for now, but I've got the information we need, Clint replied. Foster's men are on my tail. I don't have much time. Where are you? Jessica asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. Head to the old warehouse on 5th Street. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't follow me. Just wait, Clint instructed, his voice firm. Before Jessica could respond, the call ended. Her hand trembled slightly as she put the phone back into her pocket. This was it, the point of no return. They had the evidence, and they had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Jessica stood up and headed toward the exit. She wasn't going to let Clint face this alone. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As Clint neared the warehouse, he could feel the tension mounting. The file was still clutched tightly in his hand, and the information contained within it could take down a city full of corrupt officials. But the path to exposing it was anything but clear. He had to stay one step ahead of those who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The sound of sirens in the distance reminded Clint just how dangerous things had become. Every move they made now had the potential to set off a chain reaction, and the risks were higher than ever before. He approached the warehouse, looking over his shoulder as he made his way inside. The old building was dilapidated, a perfect hiding spot in the chaos of the city. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rust, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging overhead. Jessica was already there, standing near the far wall, her posture tense as she watched him approach. Clint let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They know we're coming, he said, his voice low and steady. It's only a matter of time before they try to shut us down. But we've got the file. We've got the proof. Now we just need to make sure it gets into the right hands. Jessica stepped forward. You're sure about this? Once we send this out, there's no going back. Clint nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. I'm sure. This is bigger than anything we've faced before. But we can't stop now. Too much is at stake. They both knew the consequences of what they were about to do. The corruption ran deep, and the people they were up against weren't just dangerous, they were ruthless. But Clint had no intention of backing down. Let's do it, Jessica said, her voice firm with determination. Clint pulled out his phone and quickly began typing out a message to their trusted contacts, a list of journalists, law enforcement officials, and allies they had cultivated over the years. The file was attached, ready to be sent. As Clint hit send, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. He whipped around, his heart racing. The door had been kicked open, and standing there in the doorway was a figure Clint had never expected to see. It was Bill Harper. And behind him, several of Foster's guards stood, weapons drawn. Game's over, Clint, Harper said, his tone dripping with venom. You've made a mistake thinking you could take us down. Clint's heart pounded as he realized just how close they were to losing everything. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. The warehouse was filled with a deafening silence as Clint's eyes locked onto Bill Harper, the man who had been at the center of everything from the beginning. The cold, calculating expression on Harper's face sent a chill down Clint's spine. Behind him stood a handful of armed guards, their weapons steady, their stance unwavering. It was clear that Harper wasn't here for negotiation, he was here to end this. You've really gone too far this time, Clint, Harper said, his voice dripping with disdain. You've meddled in things that are far beyond your understanding. And now, it's time to pay the price. Clint's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He had no intention of letting Harper's threats intimidate him. The file, the information, they were his bargaining chip now. He had to keep his cool. You don't get it, do you, Harper? Clint replied, his voice steady despite the danger surrounding him. This isn't just about me or you. This is about everything you've built on lies. The people you've hurt. And that's not something I'm just going to walk away from. Harper's smile was thin, calculating. You think anyone's going to believe you, Clint? You're just a disgraced former lawyer trying to make a name for himself. You don't have the power or the resources to bring me down. Clint took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. You're wrong. I have something you'll never have, the truth. And that's more powerful than anything you could throw at me. As Clint spoke, he felt the weight of the file in his pocket. The evidence he'd gathered, the web of corruption stretching from Foster to Harper, from the politicians to the crime lords, was damning. But the timing had to be perfect. He needed a way out, a way to ensure this information would make it to the right people. Suddenly, Jessica stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. You've underestimated us, Harper. You may have the power, the money, and the influence, but you don't have the one thing that matters. Integrity. And that's why you're losing. Harper's eyes flashed with anger. You think I'm just going to let you walk away from this? You think you've won? Clint shook his head, his expression hardening. No, but you will. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The timing, the pieces of the puzzle, the risks, they all led to this single, inevitable confrontation. Clint knew he had one shot at taking Harper down for good. With a sudden movement, Clint pulled the file from his pocket and threw it across the room to Jessica. The guards immediately turned their attention to her, but it was too late. She was already moving, her quick reflexes taking her toward a safe corner of the warehouse, where she could protect the evidence. Get the file. Harper shouted, his voice panicked now. Don't let them get away with it. Clint knew this was the moment. If he could keep Harper distracted just a little longer, Jessica could get the file into the hands of the right people, people who could expose Harper's entire operation, his web of corruption. But Harper wasn't done. He moved quickly, his eyes locked on Clint with a deadly intensity. Clint was ready. As Harper charged toward him, Clint dodged to the side, grabbing a metal pipe from a nearby stack of materials. The guards followed Harper's lead, but they hesitated, unsure of what Clint would do next. He didn't have time to waste. With one swift motion, Clint swung the pipe, knocking one of the guards to the ground, temporarily disarming him. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Clint's mind raced, more backup. He had to think fast. "Clint, it's done." Jessica's voice rang out from behind him, a glimmer of hope in her words. "The file's on its way. It's with someone who can expose them all. It's over." Clint's heart surged with relief, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down now. Harper, however, was not about to back off. He was determined to fight, and Clint could see the fury burning in his eyes. "You think you've won, don't you?" Harper sneered, wiping a smear of blood from his lip. "You think the system will just let you walk away with all that evidence? You really don't understand how deep this goes, Clint. People like me, we don't lose. Ever." Clint's grip tightened on the pipe, but he knew the time for fighting was running out. The warehouse was no longer a safe haven, it was a ticking clock. The sirens were getting closer, and they couldn't stay much longer. But he wasn't going to let Harper make his final move. "I've seen what you can do, Harper," Clint said, his voice low but certain. "But you've made a fatal mistake. You think you control the system, but I've just pulled the rug out from under you." Clint stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Harper's face. He was done with playing by the rules that Harper had set. This time, he was in control. With a sudden burst of energy, Clint lunged at Harper, knocking him off balance and pinning him against the nearest pillar. The guards scrambled, but they were too late. The damage had been done. Clint's breath came in sharp gasps as he held Harper there, the power shifting for the first time in this battle. "This ends now," Clint growled, his voice low, filled with the conviction of a man who had been fighting for too long. Outside, the sound of sirens blared as law enforcement swarmed toward the warehouse. Clint knew they would be there in minutes. His heart pounded as he looked at Jessica, who had managed to secure the file with their contact. The plan was falling into place. The people they needed to reach were finally going to get the truth. Harper's face twisted in anger as he struggled against Clint's hold. "You'll never get away with this," Harper spat. "Do you really think the police will take your side? You think they'll believe you over me?" Clint didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension, and suddenly, the doors to the warehouse burst open. Several officers stormed in, their guns drawn. "This is the FBI," one of them barked. "Get on the ground." The remaining guards hesitated, and Clint quickly released Harper, who slumped against the pillar, his defiance flickering but not completely extinguished. Jessica stepped forward, holding out the file. "This is all the evidence you need," she said firmly, handing it over to one of the agents. "It's all here. Harper's entire operation." The agent took the file, his eyes scanning the contents briefly before turning back to Clint. "This is it," the agent said, nodding. "You've done the right thing. We've got him now." Clint didn't feel victorious, not yet. But he did feel something else, relief. They had done it. The web of corruption was finally unraveling, piece by piece. As the officers cuffed Harper and his men, Clint exchanged a glance with Jessica. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still more battles ahead, but they had won this one. And that, for now, was enough. The warehouse was quieter now, the once tense atmosphere dissipating as the last of Harper's men were taken away in handcuffs. Clint stood still, his eyes focused on the flashing lights outside the building. The distant sound of sirens was a bittersweet melody. It meant victory, but it also signified just how far they had come, and how much more there was to do. Inside the warehouse, Jessica walked over to Clint, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She had been the one to get the file into the hands of the FBI, the one who had trusted their contact, the one who had pushed through her own doubts. Without her, Clint knew, none of this would have been possible. "You did it," she said softly, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "We did it." Clint let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It had been a long road, full of danger and betrayal, and there had been times when he wasn't sure they would make it. But now, standing here with Jessica, watching as the corrupt officials were carted off to face justice, Clint felt a sense of accomplishment that he had never felt before. "We did," Clint replied, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "But it's not over." "Not yet." Jessica nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They had taken down Harper, but the web of corruption they had uncovered was vast, stretching across multiple levels of government, business, and crime. Harper was just a cog in the machine, and while his arrest was a huge win, it was only the beginning of what would be a much larger battle. "We've only scratched the surface," Jessica said, her gaze flicking to the agents who were busy processing the evidence. "There's still a lot of work ahead of us." Clint ran a hand through his hair, the exhaustion of the past few days finally hitting him. "I know. But we can't back down now. We've come too far to stop." Suddenly, one of the FBI agents approached them. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, with short, graying hair and a stern expression. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I need to speak with you." Clint turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's this about?" "I'm Agent Turner," the man said, offering his hand. "We've been tracking Harper for a while, but we never had enough evidence to move on him. Until now. Thanks to you, we have everything we need to take down his entire operation. You've done the FBI a huge service, Mr. Eastwood." Clint shook his hand, the weight of Turner's words sinking in. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He had been a lawyer, a man who had lost everything and fought to get it back. But now, it seemed, his actions were making a real difference. "I'm just doing what's right," Clint said simply. Turner nodded, but there was something in his eyes that Clint couldn't quite place. "Well, whatever your reasons, your actions have helped expose something much bigger than Harper. We're going to need your help moving forward. We've got a lot of people to take down, and we need all the information you have." Clint glanced at Jessica, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. This was it, the moment where they decided whether to keep fighting or walk away. "Of course," Clint said after a pause. "Whatever you need. I'm in." Turner smiled, his stern demeanor softening slightly. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll be in touch soon." As the agent turned to leave, Clint let out a long breath. It wasn't over yet. There were still people to be brought to justice, still a battle to fight. But for the first time in a long while, Clint felt like he was on the right side of history. Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know, you don't have to keep doing this," she said quietly. "You've already risked everything. Maybe it's time to walk away." Clint shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think I could even if I wanted to. This fight isn't just mine anymore. It's ours." Jessica smiled back, and for the first time in days, Clint felt a sense of peace. He knew there was still much to do, but they had taken the first major step. Together. Days passed, and Clint found himself back in his office, the phone ringing off the hook with calls from various media outlets, law firms, and even a few politicians who wanted to offer their support, or, in some cases, their apologies. The truth had come to light, and the shockwaves were still reverberating through the city. But Clint didn't care about the praise or the attention. What mattered was the people who had been harmed by the system, the ones who had suffered under the weight of corruption. They were the ones who needed justice, and Clint was determined to see it through. One morning, Clint received a call from his old friend Sarah Mitchell, a journalist he had known for years. She was one of the first people he had trusted with the truth about Harper's operation. "Clint, I have to say, I'm impressed," Sarah's voice crackled over the phone. "You've done something no one else could. But I think there's more to this than what we're seeing." Clint sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "I've been digging," Sarah said, her tone serious. "I've uncovered some names, some connections that go even deeper than Harper. We're talking about people in high places, bigger players who have been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. If we want to finish this, we need to expose them too." Clint's heart sank. He knew it wouldn't be this simple. There were always more layers to peel back, more people to expose. "I'm listening," Clint said quietly. "I'll send you the files," Sarah replied. "But be careful. These people don't play by the rules. They'll do anything to protect themselves." Clint exhaled slowly. "I've been careful my whole life, Sarah. But now it's time to go all in." As the days passed, Clint and Jessica continued their work, carefully building the case against the remaining players. They knew they couldn't take them down all at once, everything had to be methodical, calculated. But Clint wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had seen what happened when they stood together, when they fought for what was right. The corrupt were being exposed, one by one. The stakes were higher than ever, but Clint knew they had a chance. They had a chance to take down an empire of corruption, to set things right for the people who had been crushed under its weight. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Clint Eastwood wasn't about to stop now. The morning after the arrest of Bill Harper and the dramatic revelations that followed, Clint Eastwood sat at his desk, his mind swirling. The faint hum of his office's fluorescent lights seemed distant, almost surreal, as the weight of the task ahead settled in. He had taken down a major player in a sprawling network of corruption, but the battle was far from over. His thoughts drifted to the files Sarah Mitchell had sent him, the files that could be the key to unraveling the rest of the empire. He knew he couldn't do it alone. Jessica had been his ally through the darkest moments of this fight, but now, more than ever, they needed to be cautious. There were enemies lurking in every shadow, powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to use whatever means necessary to protect their interests. Clint's phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Jessica, "We need to talk. I found something in the files that doesn't add up." His stomach tightened. What could it be? He quickly typed back, "Meet me at the office in 20. As he waited, Clint's mind raced. The files were extensive, too extensive, in fact. What had Sarah uncovered that was so dangerous? More names, more connections, more strings that needed pulling. Was Harper just a pawn, as they had suspected? Or was there something more sinister at play? 20 minutes later, Jessica entered the office, her expression tense. She carried a large manila folder, the edges worn, the contents clearly well read. She wasted no time, dropping the folder onto Clint's desk. "There's something off," Jessica said, her voice low. "I started going through Sarah's files, and there's one name that keeps popping up, Diana Foster. She's been connected to Harper, yes, but it's not just that. She's got ties to people in government, the financial sector, and the military." Clint's brow furrowed. "The military?" "Yes," Jessica continued, pacing now. "I've cross-referenced everything, and there are patterns, money flows, shell companies, political donations, all directed back to her. She's not just a local businesswoman or some political player. She's deeply embedded in the system. And I think she's playing both sides of the fence." Clint sat up straighter. "If Foster's involved in this, then we're dealing with something far bigger than we thought." Jessica nodded. "Exactly. Harper was just the tip of the iceberg. Foster is pulling the strings behind the scenes, controlling things from the shadows. And what's worse, she's got connections in places we can't even begin to touch. Clint's mind churned, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Diana Foster had been a name that had come up earlier in the investigation, but they had never fully connected her to Harper. Now, it seemed, she was at the center of everything, an elusive figure who had carefully built an empire of corruption over decades. "What's our next move?" Jessica asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We can't just go after her like we did with Harper. She's too powerful." Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought. "We need leverage. Something that can expose her for who she really is. We've already shown that Harper can be taken down. Now, we need to take Foster down the same way." Jessica met his gaze, determination in her eyes. "And we're going to do that by using the same tactic. We find the cracks in her empire, the things she's tried to bury, and we bring it all into the light." Clint's lips curved into a small smile. "Exactly. We'll use the same tactics we used on Harper: research, surveillance, and building a case. But we need more than just evidence. We need allies." "Who do you have in mind?" Jessica asked. "I've got a few contacts left from my old days as a lawyer," Clint said, standing up and walking over to the window. The city stretched out before him, a concrete jungle filled with secrets. "People who can help us dig deeper into Foster's connections. And if we can get the right people on our side, we might be able to corner her." The next few days were a blur of activity. Clint and Jessica met with their trusted contacts, people who had their own reasons for wanting to see Foster brought to justice. They worked tirelessly, cross-referencing financial records, political donations, and public records. Slowly but surely, the web began to unravel. One name kept emerging from the shadows: General Thomas Harrington. He was a former high-ranking military officer with deep ties to Foster. The more Clint and Jessica dug, the more they realized that Harrington had been involved in numerous shady deals, some of them involving the military-industrial complex. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, and Foster had been using Harrington to gain it. As they compiled their findings, Clint felt a familiar weight in his chest. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore, it was about taking down a network that had manipulated the system for years. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous the path became. One evening, as Clint and Jessica reviewed their notes in the office, Clint's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, another message from Sarah Mitchell. "I found something big. You need to see this. Meet me tonight. Bring Jessica." Clint's stomach flipped. "What now?" He quickly texted back, "We'll be there in an hour." As they drove to Sarah's office, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that could change everything. What had Sarah found? And would it be enough to finally take down Diana Foster? When they arrived at Sarah's office, the journalist was waiting for them, her face pale. She didn't waste any time. "I found the smoking gun," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's not just about money and power. It's about national security." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Sarah opened her laptop, showing them a series of classified documents. They were related to a series of covert military operations, ones that had been funded by black market dealings, all traced back to Diana Foster's shell companies. Foster had been laundering money through defense contracts, funneling it into private companies that were manufacturing weapons and supplies for illegal operations. And at the center of it all, General Harrington. He had been using his military connections to funnel money into Foster's coffers, and in return, she had been helping fund operations that put the country at risk. "This is bigger than we thought," Jessica whispered. "This is treason." Clint felt the gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. If they exposed this, if the public learned of Foster's involvement, it would be catastrophic. The fallout would ripple through the highest echelons of government, military, and business. People would lose their careers, their freedom, and maybe even their lives. But there was no going back now. They had the evidence. They had the names. They had the leverage. "We're going to take her down," Clint said, his voice steely with determination. "And this time, we're going to make sure she never sees the light of day again." As the weight of their next move settled on Clint's shoulders, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. They were closer than ever, but the most dangerous part of the fight was still ahead. They had exposed the puppet master. Now, they just needed to pull the strings. The night was thick with anticipation as Clint, Jessica, and Sarah sat around the dimly lit table in Sarah's cramped office, the weight of their discovery hanging heavily in the air. The classified documents on Sarah's laptop were damning, filled with names and dates that tied Diana Foster directly to illicit military contracts, money laundering, and covert operations. But as Clint stared at the screen, he knew their victory wasn't secured yet. They had the evidence, but now, they had to figure out how to bring Foster down without getting themselves killed in the process. "Clint, we can't sit on this much longer," Jessica said, breaking the silence. Her eyes were filled with a mix of urgency and fear. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Foster has too many allies in high places. She's not going to go down without a fight." Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden surface of the desk. "I know. But if we go public with this too soon, she'll have all the time in the world to cover her tracks. We need to be smart about this." Sarah, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "There's another angle we can explore. I've been talking to some people in Washington, and it turns out there are some lawmakers who have been quietly investigating Foster. They've been trying to get their hands on this evidence for months, but they've been blocked at every turn. If we take this to them, show them what we have, we might be able to get them on our side. With the right political pressure, we can force Foster's hand." Clint nodded slowly. It was a risky move, but it was the best option they had. The idea of working with politicians made him uneasy. He had seen firsthand how easily power and greed could corrupt, but right now, they didn't have many choices. "All right," Clint said, his voice low but steady. "We take this to the right people. But we make sure we're protected. No one gets to walk away from this unscathed. Not Foster, and not us." Jessica leaned forward, her expression firm. "I'll make the calls. We'll have the backing we need." Clint's thoughts were already racing ahead, mapping out their next steps. "I'll contact a few of my old contacts in law enforcement. We'll need backup when the time comes. Foster won't go down quietly." As Sarah and Jessica began to make their preparations, Clint's mind wandered to the broader implications of their actions. They were about to take on one of the most powerful and dangerous women in the country. There would be no turning back once they stepped into the ring. But Clint had always known this was where it would lead. He had been in the fight for justice for far too long to back out now. The following week felt like a blur. Clint, Jessica, and Sarah worked tirelessly behind the scenes, building their case and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Foster. Each day brought new obstacles, messages from unknown numbers warning them to back off, shadowy figures lurking just outside their offices, but they pressed forward, knowing they couldn't stop now. It was late one afternoon when Clint received an unexpected phone call from General Thomas Harrington. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and Clint's gut told him that something wasn't right. "We need to talk," Harrington said. "I know what you're trying to do. And I can promise you one thing, you're not going to get away with it." Clint's pulse quickened. The general's warning was clear. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was part of the machine that had been propping up Foster's empire. And now, he was making it personal. "You think I'm afraid of you, Harrington?" Clint replied, his voice low. "You're a pawn, just like the rest of them. And when this is over, you'll be the one who's answering to the law." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. You've made a dangerous enemy, Eastwood. If you think Foster is the only threat you'll face, you're mistaken. This goes much deeper than you realize. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what this meant. Harrington wasn't just threatening him, he was sending a warning that the stakes were higher than they had ever been. They weren't just fighting a corrupt businesswoman anymore. They were fighting an entire system, one that was entrenched in power, influence, and violence. "I'm not afraid of you, Harrington," Clint said, his voice ice-cold. "You'll be the one running, not me." The general didn't respond, and Clint could hear the faint sound of a click as the call ended. Clint's hand gripped the phone tighter as he sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The general's words echoed in his ears, "This goes much deeper than you realize." By the time Clint and Jessica made their move, the pressure had reached its breaking point. They had gathered enough evidence, made enough contacts, and ensured their safety with the help of allies in law enforcement. It was time to go public. They met with a select group of lawmakers, people who had already begun to take an interest in Foster's activities. Their faces were a mix of skepticism and determination as Clint laid out the full scope of the corruption they had uncovered. He showed them the classified documents, the financial records, the names of the people involved, and the covert operations that had put the country at risk. As Clint finished speaking, there was a long pause. Then, one of the senators, an older man with a stern expression, leaned forward and spoke. "This is big," he said. "And it's going to get a lot bigger. But you're right. Foster is a cancer, and it's time we cut her out. We have the power to bring her down, but we need your help to make sure the truth doesn't get buried." Clint nodded. "You have everything you need. But you need to move fast. Foster won't wait long to protect herself." The group agreed, and within hours, the first steps were taken. Public hearings were scheduled, and a team of federal agents was dispatched to secure the evidence. The groundwork was laid for the takedown of Diana Foster and her entire network of corruption. But as the news broke, the consequences became clear. Foster's allies in the government and the military began to mobilize, pulling strings to delay the process and suppress the truth. The media was flooded with rumors, false reports, and smear campaigns. It seemed as though the system was fighting back. And just as Clint had feared, General Harrington made his move. A shadowy figure appeared at Clint's office one afternoon, a man with a gun, sent to send a message. "Clint Eastwood," the man said, his voice cold as steel, "this is your last warning. Stop this now, or you'll pay the price." Clint stood tall, unwavering. "I've already paid the price. Now, it's time to make sure everyone else does, too." The man stared him down for a moment, then backed away slowly, disappearing into the shadows. Clint knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice wasn't over, it had just begun. But this time, Clint was ready. The final showdown was coming. And this time, he wouldn't back down. The air was thick with tension as Clint Eastwood stood outside the government building, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. The world was on the verge of unraveling. His investigation into Diana Foster and her vast criminal empire had reached its boiling point, and now, the truth was about to come to light. But it wasn't going to be easy. The plan was simple: force Foster to reveal herself for what she truly was. Clint had long known that the fight against her wouldn't be won in a courtroom, but on the front lines. The hearings were set, and the evidence had been prepared. But the opposition was fierce, and there were powerful people behind the scenes who would stop at nothing to protect her. As Clint stood outside, his mind raced. This wasn't just about bringing down a corrupt businesswoman, it was about fighting an entire system, a network of powerful individuals whose fingers were dug deep into the fabric of the government and the military. It was a war, and Clint was ready to wage it, no matter the cost. "Are you ready for this?" Jessica's voice broke him from his thoughts. Clint turned to see her walking toward him, her face resolute, but there was a hint of apprehension in her eyes. She had been with him through every twist and turn of this investigation, and now, they were about to confront their biggest adversary yet. "As ready as I'll ever be," Clint said, offering a reassuring smile. "But we've got to move fast. If we wait too long, they'll bury everything we've worked for." Jessica nodded. "Then let's do it." Together, they entered the building, passing through the security checkpoints and into the hall where the hearing was set to take place. Inside, a group of lawmakers, journalists, and federal agents were already gathered. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone knew that this was the moment that could change everything. Clint took his seat at the front of the room, Jessica beside him, and Sarah a few rows back. The door opened, and the group fell silent as Diana Foster made her grand entrance. She was every inch the polished businesswoman, a smile playing on her lips as she walked to the podium. But there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of fear hidden behind the veneer of confidence. She knew what was coming. Clint watched her carefully, his eyes narrowing as she took her seat. He could sense her calculating mind, the wheels turning as she tried to find a way to salvage her empire. But it was too late. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable. The hearing began, and one by one, the lawmakers and agents presented their findings. Clint's voice rang out as he spoke passionately about the corruption that had plagued the government, about the countless lives destroyed by Foster's greed, and the powerful individuals who had aided her in her rise to power. As Clint finished speaking, he glanced at Jessica, who gave him a subtle nod. It was time. Sarah stepped forward with the laptop, and the room held its breath as she began to play the video they had uncovered. It was a recording of a secret meeting between Foster and several high-ranking military officials. The conversation was damning: plans to funnel money into private companies that had ties to illegal arms deals, and the manipulation of government contracts for personal gain. The room went silent as the video played, the evidence sinking in. Foster's face, once composed, now twisted with panic as the truth was laid bare for all to see. "Do you have any explanation for this, Ms. Foster?" one of the lawmakers asked, his voice cold and unforgiving. Foster's smile faltered, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. She stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to regain her composure. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "I have done nothing wrong." Clint's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unwavering. "The truth is right there, Foster. You can deny it all you want, but the evidence speaks for itself." Foster glared at him, her eyes narrowing with contempt. "You think you've won, Eastwood? You think you've exposed me? You have no idea what you're up against. There are people who will stop at nothing to protect me." Clint didn't flinch. "I've been up against worse than you. You may have your allies, but the truth has a way of cutting through everything. You're done." The tension in the room was palpable. It was clear that Foster knew her empire was crumbling. But even as the evidence mounted against her, Clint knew that this wouldn't be the end. There would be more obstacles to overcome. The forces that had protected Foster for so long would make one last attempt to save her. Suddenly, the door to the hearing room burst open, and a group of armed men stormed inside. The room erupted into chaos as everyone scrambled for cover. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he immediately grabbed Jessica and pulled her to the floor as bullets ricocheted off the walls. "Get down!" Clint shouted, pulling out his own weapon as the attackers advanced. In the chaos, Clint saw the figure of General Harrington standing near the back of the room, a smug expression on his face. He was orchestrating the final act of this battle, trying to silence the truth before it could spread any further. But Clint wasn't about to let him get away with it. "Stay down!" Clint barked at Jessica, his mind working quickly. He could feel the weight of the situation. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. Jessica, her face pale but resolute, nodded and grabbed the emergency radio they had brought. "I'll call for backup. You take care of them." Clint nodded, his heart pounding. There was no turning back now. With one swift motion, Clint rolled out from behind cover and fired, hitting one of the attackers in the leg. The man crumpled to the ground, but Clint didn't pause. His training kicked in as he moved, taking down two more assailants with quick, decisive shots. He didn't have time to think, only to act. Meanwhile, Jessica was on the phone with law enforcement, calling in reinforcements. The sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that help was on the way. General Harrington, realizing that his plan was falling apart, made a break for the door, but Clint was already ahead of him. With a quick move, Clint tackled the general to the ground, pinning him there as the room erupted into chaos around them. "Not so fast," Clint growled, his voice low and dangerous. Harrington struggled, but Clint kept him firmly in place. "You're not going anywhere. You're going to answer for all of this." As the sound of approaching police sirens grew louder, the remaining attackers began to retreat, realizing they had lost the battle. Within moments, law enforcement arrived, securing the room and apprehending the assailants. Clint stood over Harrington, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The battle was won, but it was far from over. They had exposed the truth, but the fight for justice was only just beginning. The aftermath was swift. Diana Foster was arrested, her empire collapsing under the weight of the evidence. General Harrington was charged with treason and conspiracy, his military career in ruins. The powerful network that had protected them for so long was now in shambles. But as Clint and Jessica stood outside the courthouse, watching the news unfold, Clint knew that the true victory wasn't in the takedown itself, it was in the message they had sent. The fight for justice wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clint turned to Jessica with a weary but satisfied smile. "We did it," he said softly. Jessica returned his smile, her eyes filled with pride. "We did. And the truth won." The fight was over, but the war for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was still. The echoes of the dramatic takedown reverberated through Clint's mind as he walked out into the bright, bustling afternoon sunlight. The weight of victory was heavy on his shoulders, but the world outside the courthouse felt both the same and completely different. It was as if he had stepped into a new reality, a world where justice had prevailed over corruption, at least for the moment. But Clint knew better. This was not the end. It was just the beginning. As he stepped through the courthouse doors, the media swarmed him, their cameras flashing like 1,000 tiny lightning bolts. The questions came fast, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of confusion and excitement. "Clint Eastwood, is this the end of Diana Foster's empire? How do you feel about the government's role in this case? What's next for you? Will you continue your fight for justice?" Clint held up his hands to calm the storm of reporters, a tired but satisfied smile crossing his face. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice firm, but calm. "It's about the truth. It's about exposing corruption where it hides and ensuring that those in power are held accountable for their actions. Diana Foster's empire is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And the fight for justice, it never ends. There's always more work to be done." As the crowd dispersed and Clint finally found a quiet moment with Jessica and Sarah, the exhaustion hit him all at once. He had been running on adrenaline for so long, constantly fighting, constantly strategizing. But now, standing here with his team, he could breathe, finally, after all this time. "Can you believe it?" Jessica said with a soft laugh, her expression a mix of disbelief and triumph. "We actually did it. We brought them down." Clint glanced at her, his eyes tired but proud. "We did. But I'm not about to stop now. There are still more people out there who think they can get away with this." Sarah, who had been quietly standing by, nodded in agreement. "We've made a dent in the system, but we both know this is just the start. The forces we're up against, those who pull the strings from the shadows, they won't just roll over. We'll have to stay vigilant. Always." Clint turned to look at Sarah, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. This wasn't a battle that could be won overnight. It was an ongoing fight, one that would require constant dedication, tenacity, and sacrifice. The system that had allowed people like Diana Foster and General Harrington to thrive had been deeply ingrained in the country's structure. Their takedown was a victory, but the war for justice was far from over. "You're right," Clint said. "But today is a reminder that justice can prevail. We're not fighting alone anymore. The truth is stronger than ever." Jessica smiled and clapped him on the back. "You've been saying that from the start, Clint. You've been preaching that for years. But now people are starting to listen." For a moment, Clint allowed himself to believe it. The world was changing, slowly but surely. The old guard of corruption that had lurked in the shadows for so long was finally starting to fall, one piece at a time. And people like Clint, Jessica, and Sarah were standing at the forefront, pushing for a future where power wasn't wielded in secret. As they made their way back to the office, Clint's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID. It was a number he didn't recognize. Without hesitation, he answered. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice steady. "Mr. Eastwood," came the voice on the other end. It was deep and measured, recognizable but cold. "This is Senator Graham. I've been following your work, and I have to say, I'm impressed. What you've done for this country, it's beyond anything I expected." Clint's eyebrows furrowed. "I appreciate the compliment, Senator, but I'm not looking for accolades. Just doing what needs to be done." "I understand. But I think you may be underestimating the full scale of what you've uncovered. You've made quite an impact. And we want you to be part of the next phase, of the cleanup, if you will." Clint's curiosity piqued, but he remained cautious. "What exactly are you proposing?" "There are still plenty of people in the system, both in politics and in the military, who are benefiting from corruption. But we can't clean it up without inside knowledge. Your insights, your tenacity, they could help us get rid of this rot once and for all. We need someone like you. Someone who's not afraid to take on the system." Clint paused, thinking carefully. The idea of joining the very system he had been fighting against wasn't something he could take lightly. But the offer had weight. And he knew that if he turned it down, he might never have the chance to make the kind of change that was needed. "I'm not interested in being part of a broken system, Senator," Clint said, his voice firm. "But if you're serious about cleaning house, we'll talk. I'll make sure the people who belong in prison stay there. No exceptions." The senator hesitated before answering. "Fair enough. We'll be in touch." Clint ended the call and turned to Jessica and Sarah. "Well, it looks like the fight is just beginning. They want me to help clean up the system, but that means we need to get ready for the next round." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Are you considering it?" Clint's eyes were steely. "I'm considering it. But only on my terms. If we're going to fight this fight, it's not going to be for power. It's going to be for the people who've been crushed under the weight of this system. It's for the ones who have no voice, no power." Sarah spoke up. "You're going to make them listen. You've already done more than most people could ever dream of. But now it's about turning the tide." Clint nodded, feeling the weight of their words. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs, too. And together, they could change the world. As they sat down to discuss their next steps, Clint realized something. The battle had been long and exhausting, but every step had brought them closer to a world where justice wasn't a luxury for the few, but a right for all. He had seen the worst of humanity, the darkest corners of power. But he had also seen something else, the indomitable will of people who refused to accept the status quo. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city as Clint looked out the window. The world was changing. And no matter how hard the fight, he knew he would be there to face it head-on, alongside his friends and allies, until the very end. They had brought the truth to light. And as long as there was breath in his body, Clint Eastwood would continue to fight for it. Justice had been served, but the journey was far from over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?